My name is Chris. I have survived every Tango operation, over 600 hours in the field, and this is my story.
This is Chris, and this is my report for the Tango operations. We were all inserted in the middle of the night for security reasons. Some SAS parachuted in, and others were inserted by boat services. Everyone got scattered. In the early hours of Tango operations, NATO's first platoons got split. Half ended up behind enemy lines and were basically wiped out by Eastern forces. 2 platoon leaders made it out of that firefight. They worked their way back behind enemy lines while tracked by opposing forces and managed to demolish an enemy island. With airstrikes, this island was occupied by Eastern forces. The Russians tried to capture the platoon leaders, but NATO managed to hold them back and extract the lost leaders before enemy forces reached them. The platoon leader's position was transmitted through the communication towers. This resulted in major firefights over the 2 communications towers between NATO and Eastern forces. GPS tracking info and satellite imagery was received through these towers. NATO had to hold them to continuously receive this info. Tower positions are in the Midwest, standing about 50 meters tall, so you can't miss them. UN and local forces tried to keep the towers out of the fight by protecting them as important civilian infrastructure objects, but they quickly lost the totality of the situation. Firefights broke out in all directions, forcing even peacekeeping units to unconventional methods. NATO platoon leaders eventually made it back to their own units after 12 hours of intensive tracking, while all factions were fighting for their own survival. Just a couple of hours later, all hell broke loose at the front line. Enemy recon patrols were everywhere. You could hear demolition charges all over when enemy installations were demolished, including our own. This fight was totally dominated by Swedish Ranger units. They had been in this area for so long with small elite forces, but when the frontline war broke out, they already had the upper hand. Regular forces never stood a chance against them. This resulted in Swedish victory in the northern parts. The rest of us, we fell back through enemy lines, which ended up in a total foobar. Now, what I'm about to tell you is strictly confidential. UN forces were blocking parts of the conflict area, probably to minimize civilian casualties and to secure safe zones. Unfortunately, these zones were of vital importance to the northern forces. At the fallback, NATO couldn't risk that the enemy forces occupied these areas firsthand. I don't know how it started, but the end result was 100% UN casualties. Everything was blamed on the eastern forces and denied by NATO. UN forces never recovered in the area after that. The peacekeeping attempts have without a doubt failed. A couple of UN officers were seen thereafter investigating and evaluating the situation, but with no end result that I know of. Recon reports inform us of an international businessman / war criminal that has been financing local resistance for years. This was shown to be the well-known Major Vladimir. I personally knew the Major from other conflicts over the years. He's turned his profession into a dirty war profiteering organization. The Major occupies properties, gets rid of the owners, and sells them. He was spotted a couple of times and hunted by all sides, but mysteriously disappeared after a few days. Rumors from locals say that the Eastern forces arrested him and handed him over to UN forces, or at least was believed to be UN forces. No one knows, since many of the UN forces got in firefights with NATO and probably no longer exist. Miraging all opposing forces to believe that they neutralize UN forces could have been the Major's right tactical move. Dropping this line of approach to the press could lead to worldwide headlines against us being here. Who knows, this could have been the trick pulled off by the Major. Not to forget that the Major was very strong financially and had a large network. He definitely had the means to do such a thing. Sweden was planning to hand over the southern area to UN forces for supervision to prevent opposing forces from taking control of the area. Large marine parks are strategically important for NATO to be able to maintain control over the area and not risk being outflanked and totally cut off. The intel was showing large troop movements from Eastern forces. It seemed that a planning of an offense against the UN-Swedish agreement was made to take over what was for so long been dominated by Swedish Marine units and prevent Sweden from taking total control. The success of this will most likely lead to the defeat of NATO. When we sent in small recon units at night time to see what was going on behind enemy lines, because we had lost we sent in small recon units nighttime to see what was going on behind enemy lines, since we lost all our units in the south. We had to start all over in this area. Some enemy patrols were encountered, but nothing out of the usual. Not until the decision was made to reclaim the zone the day after by our platoon leader. In the south, between both lakes, there is a stream with a bridge crossing it. Both lakes canalize the terrain and narrow it down to about 300 meters wide. When we reached that bridge, all hell broke loose. Eastern forces were by then already dug in and defending this passage. Recon reports never said anything about this, but probably because they weren't there at the time. We tried to reach the harbour area where we had our patrol boats stranded from our lost platoon, but we couldn't reach them since they were, of course, on the wrong side of the bridge. We did send in aircraft recon in advance, finding a base camp in the southwest which most likely belonged to Eastern units. Some armed locals were also observed, but nothing else. This fight lasted hours with casualties on both sides. The final decision was to fall back. We couldn't make it over the bridge at that point. The enemy was too strong. Swedish forces were also pounding both sides. It was a mess. I think it was the locals that finally blew up the bridge with a blast that could have woken the dead. We had to fall back to defend our road systems. Eastern forces tried to box in NATO forces by demolishing the roads. All this started when we lost the grip over the central area and moved south. They partially succeeded with their task, but I don't think it was worth it for them, since they suffered heavy losses. As it is now, we are cut off in the middle of the area and can't advance further south. All four main roads were blown up. We will eventually advance, but this will take time. Mechanized repair units haven't been notified, but honestly I don't know how or if we will be able to provide their safety and defend them during the work process. So decisions have been made to leave all our vehicles behind and take the fight to the enemy. We will most likely send in patrol units on foot. Eastern forces are operating more and more this way to avoid road wars and outflank opposing forces. The ones that stay on the road are exposed to significantly higher threat level. Mines, IEDs are a big problem, and not to mention the increase in modern anti-tank and armor-piercing rounds from 50 cals. The frontline battle was a great example, where we all went off-road to fight it out. It was a real endurance test for us all. NATO has received info that the conflict area is under high pressure from outside interests. The British government is saying that nuclear material and facility near the western lake is the production factory. EAF has in the past been harboring nuclear test material on a large island in the eastern lake. The Swedish mechanized base up north had a missile truck on it. It disappeared in 2011. We still don't know the two basic questions for that one. What was it doing there in the first place? And how did it get there? Some of the Swedish units are probably well informed regarding this matter. Speculation that it was inserted by the dark suits before we got to it. It was regrouped, or maybe should I say instantly removed from the central area. Was it the Swedes or the locals? I don't know. None of it made sense basically until Operation Apocalypse, where we got the order to find the thing. The problem was, that from my point of view, everyone else was also looking for it. I think that's why Eastern forces blew up all the roads, to prevent us not only from advancing, but to actually stop us from finding the missile ramp. Unfortunately for everyone else, we were the ones that found it. We managed to hold on and defend while our backup and escort was trying to get to us. But somehow I knew we were stuck with it because our guys never made it. Most likely because all the roads leading to us were demolished. At the same time, the ramp had to be moved to our own territories. It was only a matter of time before the opposing forces found it and us. We were relatively low on ammo, and at that point, we couldn't have held out much against proper resistance. 6 hours later, NATO had to reclaim some of the northern parts. The Swedish mechanized base camp has turned out to be a key object. This is the entry point for enemy forces into the conflict area. NATO is controlling this object as it is today. Local resistance and Swedish forces were defeated at an early point. An early control of this facility had to be established to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. NATO lost the area when we lost the front wall, and our remaining troops were cut off. We tried to get there in time, but we didn't have the resources. Unfortunately, we got there too late that morning. None of our guys were there. We had to fight our way in. As it is now, NATO is in a world of hurt. All operating units have fallen into special operations teams and are controlled by inserted special forces teams. Information and orders don't come easy, since modern technology doesn't last long out here. Eastern forces are better equipped now. Anti-tank weapons, with anti-tank weapons, which makes it much harder for our guys out there to use the roads. The will to suppress enemy forces has increased significantly. Local forces are, from my point of view, out of order since the disappearance of the major and probably the lack of finance and proper orders. UN forces have more or less disappeared.